IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. As many of you already know, tensions have been escalating between Israel and Palestine since the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan in mid-April 2021. The conflict goes back almost a century, with both sides fighting to retain territory to what both claim as their historic homeland. It has been a devastating and protracted conflict for both sides, as innocent civilians, in recent case more Palestine, have been caught in the midst of facing devastating casualties as a result. Finally, after 11 days of intense fighting, a ceasefire has been agreed. However, the question of whether a peace plan can be reached remains doubtful. Keeping this in mind, there are important lessons to be learned for conflict-ridden regions around the world. In particular, I would like to talk about the case for India and why it should refrain from adopting an Israel model in its foreign policy, in spite of having strong bilateral relations with the country. On that note, I would like to welcome Pranay Kotasthane, Deputy Director of Takshashila Institution, in joining me on today's episode. Pranay's newsletter, Anticipating the Unintended, edition number 128, covers this particular analysis, and we will be discussing it in detail today. So welcome, Pranay.
Thanks, Ameera.
So the first question I want to ask you is, based on the 4 strategic insights you mention in your newsletter, to argue why we shouldn't refrain from adopting an Israel model in spite of having good relations with them. So the first insight you mention is that force alone cannot end insurgencies. So in this context, you have given the example of the US experience in Afghanistan and how even with pulling out and being trapped in this war for decades, no peace has still been formed and fighting is still going on, if not intensifying even more now with the US pulling out. So from an Indian perspective, how do you think we can consider this an important force to avoid in the future?
Right. Thanks, Ameera. Before coming to the first point, I just want to give a backdrop. So I have long been a strong supporter of stronger India-Israel ties. And in fact, I've written about it before, how it has become a very multidimensional partnership. It just started with something related to defense, and then it has diversified into many, many elements. And that's a great positive step. Also, the fascinating thing about India-Israel relationship is the role that Indian state governments have played after 1992, which is quite unlike many other relationships where the union government played a central role. Right? So there's a fascinating story, and Nicholas Blarell's book does a great job of explaining the role that state governments play. So that is the backdrop. What concerns me, though, is that often this argument for a stronger relationship between India-Israel ties, in casual conversations, it often moves to why India should become like Israel, right? And a lot of people, I'm sure you would have also come across people saying that, Israel does so good at tackling terrorism, so we should learn from it. Or you would have heard that we should also have mandatory military service like Israel does. Why can't India kill terrorists in Pakistan the way Israel assassinates Iranian nuclear scientists? Have you heard those, by the way, in your conversations?
Yeah, I think that, currently there's this sentiment, this strong sentiment of wanting to adopt force as a means of tackling issues, which is rather, I think it's rather misinterpreted in the context of Indian relations, where we see stronger players and we get influenced by them, and why we should stop doing this.
Right. So what that was sort of the motive for this post. I just wanted to look at some of the elements of Israel's strategy on national security. And maybe it works for Israel, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I haven't studied Israel in that great detail. But I wanted to look at, can we transpose some of these to the Indian context? And I think we can't. And that's why I'll give 4 or 5 reasons why I say this, right? So the first argument that I made was, one lesson to learn from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine is that force cannot end insurgencies by itself. And you can see it from what's happening in Israel-Palestine or what is happening in US experience in Afghanistan. The key lesson is that once you enter a situation where you are only doubling down on force, then it might stop terrorism. It will actually modulate terrorism, not even end terrorism, but it cannot end insurgencies alone. So, and there's a fascinating book, a recent book, we can link it to that, by Professor Jacqueline Hazelton, and it looks at whether it's called Bullets Not Ballots. And it looks at what is the experience from ending insurgencies in many case studies across the world. And what she finds is that ending insurgencies requires force in the beginning, but towards the latter half, it requires a lot of co-opting of rival elites, making compromises with the elites of the other side, making compromises with insurgent factions, etc. Right? So there is a key political element involved, and you can see it from the Indian context as well. Places where we've controlled insurgencies like Mizoram, Punjab, etc. It was not just force, right? After force, there was a lot of thing which happened related to co-opting rival elites, making compromises, etc. Right? But if that doesn't happen and you are only going to double down on the force every time, then in fact what happens is that the deal making of this sort actually becomes even more difficult, right? So how can you expect a person on the other side to actually make some compromises after you have killed many people of their own area, right? That person completely loses legitimacy even if they are trying to do any compromises with you, right? And I think that applies to what's happening in the Indian context as well. Like if you see in J&K, the cautionary tale for us is that the more the disproportional use of force happens in Kashmir, the difficult it will become for India to end the insurgency. Maybe, we can modulate terrorism, but that's not the goal, isn't it? The goal is to end insurgency and India and to get into a situation where peace and prosperity of Kashmiris is coterminous with peace and prosperity of every other Indian across its length and breadth as well. So the more the force applied, the farther away we go from that goal.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that point, because my next question was related to the Kashmiri issue. So you mentioned another reason, saying that assassinating terrorists can be both ineffective and high cost. And we see this sort of, romanticization, as you mentioned, of the assassination program. But we have often seen that this has failed. In the case of, suppose, Israel's intelligence, they have, their insurgent efforts have actually created more chaos than it has peace, and it's actually even worsening now. So in the case of Kashmir, within the broader Kashmiri policy, I don't really see insurgency ending anytime soon. But why do you think that is, without us explicitly, supporting models like the Israeli model?
Right. So coming back to sort of Kashmir issue, there has been a lot of attempt at, hearts and minds doctrine and things like that, which actually modulated terrorism, was even trying to move towards a more peaceful situation. But over the last few years, it has become difficult, because more and more what we are seeing is this is being seen from a territorial perspective and a territorial integrity perspective, rather than the welfare of Indians there itself, right? So I think that is, I'll actually jump to that point itself. One lesson from Israel-Palestine conflict that I derive, for example, is just that, people matter more than territory. And it's something that we often forget. We mistake this notion of country and a nation, and the fact that the geographical construct of whether the map of India is in a way that it is or it should be is more important than the peace and prosperity of its citizens itself. So if you see the Israel-Palestine conflict itself, it's a visceral conflict over a piece of land, right? And it has like a deep history. There is thousands of years of history. There is deep-seated animosity. And what it results is that even localized fights over small pieces of land often acts as triggers for a full-scale arms exchange, right? So there is this underlying sentiment of distrust which always underlies over many, many years. And then a small trigger actually ends up igniting this sort of a conflict, right? Now, the lesson that I derive for India is that the desire for territorial integrity should not override the primary goal of peace and prosperity for Indians, right? And we have instances of that. Like we've taken, for example, recently itself, the 2015 land boundary agreement between India and Bangladesh. India actually gave more land away to Bangladesh than the land it got in return. Same with the maritime dispute resolution as well. India actually went back on its own claims based on the Permanent Court of Arbitration award. Right? So, in the strict sense of territorial integrity, we actually violated India's territorial integrity.
Yeah.
Right? But so would we say that it was not a good thing to do? I will definitely say it was a great thing to do, because the funniest thing, and actually an unfortunately funny thing in the India-Bangladesh border, the land border, was that there were things like which were third order enclaves, a piece of India within a piece of Bangladesh, within a piece of India, within a piece of Bangladesh. So these abominations were created, and the result of this was that people who were living in such areas were neither Bangladeshis, neither Indians, neither the Indian state cared for them, neither the Bangladeshi state cared for them, because how do you do this, right? Like you are within a territory, within someone else's territory. So there was no governance in these areas which we can be proud of, right? So now with India giving away more of this land, there were citizens who became Bangladeshi citizens, some people who became Indian citizens, and we are moving to a more sustainable mechanism where we can provide governance to these people, right? So it was a good thing. So it's just one instance of where territorial integrity shouldn't supersede peace and prosperity. Now, coming back to your question on Kashmir, right? That's where I see again that in recent times we are seeing this fascination or overt emphasis on territorial integrity rather than peace and prosperity of Indian Kashmiris there, right? So if we look at it from that lens, then there will be compromises with Pakistan, maybe with respect to POK or something else, but it will be fine, as long as we can have peace and prosperity for Indians, which includes Kashmiris and all Kashmiris, then it's fine. We don't need to be so hung up on this idea that our map was a certain way in 1947 and that's why it should be so even today.
Yeah, I think it seems quite irrelevant to be I don't know if I'm being too drastic in this, but I feel like it is quite irrelevant to fight over a piece of, a line on a border that was created, so many years ago. But the example of Bangladesh is obviously more a positive one in comparison to the Kashmir example. But can you see that our sentiments and our ideologies are also changing, and this can also be alarming in the process of achieving peace in these conflicts that we're currently intertwined in?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and that's not just limited to India, right?
Just to break you up, sorry, I just forgot to add that till 2014, I think India, correct me if I'm wrong, but India has always maintained a pro-Palestine policy or a pro-two-state policy, but things have been slowly changing since 2014 because of our stronger relations with the country, and also, in a way, we are um, with our ideologies and sentiments changing, that can also change the way we look at conflicts in our own regions. So there is a degree of influence that may not really go away unless the government really understands that peace is more important than conflict.
Right, right. Agree.
So how do we see this really changing in the next few years or the years to come?
Yeah, so again, because it is a question of sentiments, you have to change the narrative, right, about
Yeah.
what we want finally. And that's always a tough thing to do. But the India-Bangladesh example actually shows you that it is possible. I mean, imagine if this happened, we gave more land away to a state which is a smaller power on many indicators compared to India, at least at that time. And yet there was no noise, right? Like, did you see people protesting this and all that? And remember, India and Bangladesh relationships have also come under strain over many, many years. There have been clashes related to the border security on both sides, trafficking, and all those issues keep coming up, right? And yet this happened, right? So there was, and it happened because of the previous Congress government, and it was continued by this government initially. There was also the angle of the state government of West Bengal involved, and yet it sort of moved towards a positive side, right? So I would just leave this by saying that yes, narratives can be changed, and there are examples within the Indian context itself to learn from. And the narrative that we have to change is finally, people matter more than the territory. As long as we remember that, we can overcome some of these seemingly intractable issues.
Yeah. And also, I want to mention that, being us being in the information age that we are today, suppressing conflicts is almost unavoidable because, on the international scene, everyone will be pushed to, what do you say? They will be pushed to take a stand on what is right and what is wrong. So it is not that we can go about using force or wanting to use force without the whole world watching us. So, what should be the main lesson for us to keep in mind as we are progressing in this information age? Because it's only going to get more and more, technological, or more and more. Our country, what is happening in all of our countries is going to be more and more open for the world to see.
Right, right. So what I derive from that is that excessive use of force is counterproductive in the information age for many reasons. Earlier, the main lesson is that no issue is local now. Every issue is global by default, right? I mean, just take the examples of the farmer protests, right? You can say it's a local issue. Whether what is right, wrong, and all that is a different argument. We are not talking about that here. But it is a local issue, right? It's a sovereign government which is a democratically elected government, and it is doing some policies with respect to a particular sector in its own jurisdiction, right? Now that, but it became a global issue, right? I mean, people from across the world are sort of batting for this in one way or the other. Now that's the key lesson, that because no issue is local by default, setting an international narrative for a particular state becomes quite difficult now. And if you see what's happening in the Israel-Palestine context itself, remember, state is a blunt instrument. The state will use force, which can't be fine-tuned, and when it uses blunt force, wrong things will happen. When wrong things happen, it will become global, right? And that's what you see everywhere, that you see what atrocities and the bombs that came on the Palestinian side, that made a lot more news than what happened to the Israeli side, right? So whether what is right or wrong is not the question here. The idea is that international coverage will always favor the underdog rather than a state, right? That's what we are seeing over many conflicts. And when you have this sort of scenario, it becomes difficult for a state to garner international support for what it is doing. And you saw it in this case as well, right? There was quick pressure from many of the countries across the world on Israel, and then a ceasefire came about, right?
Mm.
So, and it was sort of being celebrated in Palestine when this happened, right? So,
Yeah.
so what the effect of all this was that the state action got scrutinized more than the terrorist action by Hamas. And because of that, Israel was, there was a move towards ceasefire, and that was quickly moved ahead, right? So that's the lesson for us, that states will find it very difficult to control information in the information age. So the more excessive force they use, the more international narrative will get built against them, and the more difficult it will be for them to convince the world about the action that they took.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to mention that, us being a democracy, formally a democracy at least, civilians also, the civilian perspective also matters a lot here, because in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Palestinians are a minority. But in the Indian case, if suppose, again, if we go back to the issue of Kashmir, the majority of the population there are the Muslims, and India also has a large population of Muslims. So to suppress this community would also have great consequences for India in the international narrative as well.
Yeah,
So
I'll just say it differently, but coming to the same conclusion as you did. It's not that India is a democracy and that's why all these things should happen. It's because India is a republic that this
yeah,
thing should happen, right? Republic, rule of law guarantees that whether that every Indian citizen has certain basic rights which are enshrined in the Indian constitution, right? So whether it's a Hindu, Muslim, Christian, man, woman, doesn't matter, right? The key idea is that that individual has certain rights because the Indian constitution and the Indian republic guarantees it to them. So we should be worried when that is violated,
yeah,
and the upholding the republic is more of a concern for us at this moment, not democracy. Democracy is fine. I mean, democracy just means rule by any majority, whether it is 51%. That's just a procedural concept, So, yeah, democracy is fine. We have elections, people win elections, all that is in a legitimate form. But it's a republic that we should be upholding and be worried about even more.
yeah. So, in the case of a broader geopolitical context, and particularly in the case of India, what is your opinion of the way we should be going forward in handling the regional conflicts that we are in today? Do you think ceasefires are really effective, or is there more that we need to be doing to ensure a peace process in the regions that we are facing such conflict?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. One is there are conflicts which are internal to India. There are conflicts between states. So there are, I mean, different approaches that would be required for each of them. So can't generalize it to one thing. But yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about insurgencies in general,
Yeah.
after applying force, which the Indian state, because Indian state is a powerful state, and insurgencies are really small insurgencies compared to the scale of the Indian state, applying force is not a problem for the Indian state, right? That it has done, it is capable of doing, and our forces are capable enough for all these insurgencies in application of force. But beyond that, because force cannot influence the free will of the people and the insurgents, as General Menon likes to call it, and because you can't influence the free will, finally what you will have to do is, what are the compromises that you want to make? Are you ready to exchange certain things in order to garner peace? And all those compromises have to happen, right? So we need to move towards that stage. If we see them as binaries that one side is good and other side is bad, and the other side, the only way to overcome the other side is to crush the other side, if we think in that mindset, then we are not going to end any of these.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I agree with you, and I think that in the future, the way we proceed towards handling territorial conflicts, in particular in this context, should be these are some lessons to be learned, and going forward, we should incorporate these insights while handling such conflicts.
There was one more point, Ameera, that I wanted to mention, and that's sort of again in casual conversations you hear about an appreciation for Mossad's assassination program or Shin Bet's assassination programs and all that, right? Like, oh wow, why can't we do this to Hafiz Saeed? If Israel can kill
Yeah, I think
Iranian,
in electoral speeches or campaigns and in general,
yeah,
hardline forces and stuff, they have sort of seen this as something that is inspirational.
yeah. So that's why I wanted to discuss that point as well. I think the lesson is that actually assassinating terrorists can be both ineffective and very high cost. Now, this goes counter to what is the dominant narrative today, right? And I think that dominant narrative also comes because we all watch a lot of Netflix and we all watch a lot of movies which sort of
Really not the best influence.
Sorry?
I said definitely not the best influence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't form a view on any topic by reading one book or by watching one Netflix documentary, right? But yeah, yet we do that, and we have this romanticization, especially of these extensive assassination programs. But in fact, even if you look at it from the Israel point of view, some of them have been strategically ineffective. And I think we can link to Praveen Swami's excellent take in Money Control, where he looked at Israel's assassination program, and he looked at how some of these excessive programs have actually led to more terrorism.
Yeah.
Have had exactly the opposite result that you would want, and even the effectiveness is overplayed. Like, it's not as if the ones that you see on Netflix or in movies are only a few cases, successful cases which went away, right? So we have this survivorship bias, right? We think these were the only cases which were successful. Behind them there were a lot of unsuccessful cases, right? And there were a lot of high costs that people would have paid for that. Now, I want to look at it from an Indian perspective. Like, see, one unintended, and yet we can anticipate the consequence of such excessive assassination program is that there is a potential of domestic spillover. So if the state is repeatedly using assassination against state enemies, it's not long before it becomes an acceptable method against domestic sort of anti-national enemies as well. So I'm putting anti-national enemies in air quotes. So those are some of the things. The key lesson of statecraft is that you have to maintain a cognitive dissonance. That the international affairs is an amoral world. Lots of things are possible there because there's no one government, one rule, one law, whatever, right? You have to maximize your power. But on the other hand, inside a domestic realm, especially for democratic republic states like India, you have to adhere to the norms and the rule of law which the constitution enshrines. Now, if you have a very extensive assassination program, etc., which is on the border of your state or in another state, I think maintaining this cognitive dissonance becomes difficult. And what you would end up seeing is that people will say, if we can do this elsewhere, why can't we do it within our own state? And that's a really scary proposition. Also, a secondary consequence is that once you have these programs gaining preponderance, then conflicting parties become incapable of compromise, become incapable of dialogue, which is what you essentially need eventually to end insurgencies, right? So you might kill one person, but there will be another terrorist to take charge, right? There is the supply of people who will take charges near infinity, right? So it's not possible for you to just have this program to achieve your strategic outcome of ending insurgency. So finally you would need compromises, you would need dialogue, and that becomes more and more difficult as you start to rely on assassination programs, for instance. So that was one lesson which I wanted to add.
Yeah, actually, I think most of the times, we forget that intensifying a conflict or adhering to, say, tit for tat exchanges of killing, assassinating terrorists and declaring it a victory is often fueling the conflicts. And we are usually unaware of this consequence. And I think it's really important to that you brought that up over here. And also, I want to bring up the way we will also conduct intelligence operations in the future, because when you mentioned the Praveen Swami's take in Money Control on Israel's assassination program, it also had a lot to do with the strengthened intelligence, Israel's intelligence service, internal intelligence service. So I think it's also a lesson for us and countries around the world in the way they conduct their intelligence operations without adhering to using too much force.
Absolutely, yeah.
On that note, I would like to conclude. And thank you, Pranay, for joining me and for answering these integral questions. And, I think there's a lot to be learned from the conflict that is happening right now. And, in my opinion, sooner or later, we will come to realize that these conflicts can be resolved, and we don't have to apply force, and at the end of the day they are just historical agreements that are being protracted and fought on till date, when what we should be really focusing on is achieving peace.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Meera. Yeah, I will just qualify that, yeah, force will be required in one way or the other, but force alone is not the solution.
Yeah.
And force needs to give way to other means to resolve conflicts eventually.
Well, force should be used in a mediated manner, I guess, and not in a way that can bring about terrible consequences for us as a country.
Yeah.
On that note, thanks, Pranay, for joining me again.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I would like to thank the sponsors of the network this week, Cred, Ciet, and PayPal. Thank you so much. You make everything possible. Before I recommend a couple of episodes, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about Ankush Champanerkar. Ankush was a team member who we lost due to COVID-related complications. He was a really fun guy, and I wish I knew him better than I got to know him in the short time he was with us. But I hope that you can remember him in your thoughts and prayers. Also, quick reminder about Pod for Change, the initiative set up by the podcasting community, along with Give India, the NGO partner. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and I'm sure that it would be much appreciated, any donations that you could give. With that, let me quickly give you a couple of highlights from this week. Aditi Mittal was on Cyrus Says. Great episode, do check that out. On the Habit Coach, Ashton talks about using the word impossible and suggests some better alternatives. On Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Harsh Lal, the co-founder of the Soul Store. On This Round is on me, Gauri talks to Pankit Desai, who is the co-founder and CEO of Secure Tech. And finally, I'd like to mention that we have a new show called Tere Mere Raste, hosted by Keshav Chaturvedi. This time it's a trip to the beautiful blue city of Jodhpur, but every week he's going to tell you about his travels as a photographer. It's really well put together, really well done. I couldn't be more excited about the show. Please do definitely check that out. And with that, I hope we see you again next week.
Do you know Tamil? Tamil Puriyuma? Do your children enjoy great stories that inculcate good values? Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran and I host the Storytime Tamil podcast. I am excited to share a short story with great moral values every day. Listen to Storytime Tamil on the IVM podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from.